A universal temporal alarm shatters the silence in Dr. Aris Thorne's lab. He awakens to a panicked message from the future echoing through the consoles. The Kronos lock is engaged. All of time is folding in on itself. We are the last iteration. This cryptic warning plunges us directly into a reality where humanity's entire timeline has become a prison. You are about to witness a desperate race against the collapse of the cosmos itself. By the end of this journey, you will understand the true cost of eternity and the ultimate choice between a perfect prison and a fragile chance at freedom. We will uncover who triggered this catastrophic lock, and why a single, repeating day might hold the only key to our salvation. What would you be willing to sacrifice to break a loop that has trapped all of existence? The first reset felt like a dream he could not shake. One moment, Aris was running diagnostics on the Kronos lock. The next, he was waking up at his console, the same temporal alarm blaring. The date on his screen was identical to the day before. He dismissed it as a system glitch, a phantom echo from the initial shockwave, but then Lena walked in. "Good morning, Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice cheerful. "Are you ready for the morning briefing with Director Vance?" Aris froze. Lena was his research partner, not an assistant, and Director Vance had retired 2 years ago. He played along, his mind racing. The world outside his window looked the same, the city skyline unchanged. But the people, their memories, their very roles had shifted. The second reset was worse. This time, Lena greeted him as Professor Thorne, inquiring about his lecture on temporal mechanics. She wore a pin he had never seen before, a small, silver Ouroboros. By the fifth reset, she didn't know him at all, introducing herself as the new temporal analyst assigned to his department. Each dawn, Aris awoke to the same date, trapped in a personal cage of 24 hours. Yet the cage itself was changing, its bars reforged with every cycle. The world was not simply repeating, it was rewriting itself around him, erasing his history one relationship at a time. This was not a mere malfunction. A true temporal stutter would freeze everything in place. This was an active, intelligent process, a system learning and adapting, using the loop not as a prison but as a workshop. His personal anomaly was just the first fracture in a much larger pane of glass. To understand the lock, he had to stop looking at his own reflection and start searching for the hammer that was swinging against the other side. The cracks in Aris' reality began to spiderweb outward. His personal loop was just the epicenter. While he woke to the same dawn, the world outside his lab was convulsing. News feeds on his secondary monitor flickered and stuttered, a frantic slideshow of impossible histories. One headline screamed of a golden age, announcing humanity's first peaceful contact with an alien species. He would blink, and the screen would refresh to a different era entirely, detailing a brutal global conflict over water rights, a war that the history books stated had been resolved over a century ago. The past and future were bleeding into the present, creating a chaotic tapestry of what was, what might have been, and what never should be. Then, a single signal cut through the noise, broadcasting on every frequency, overriding every screen. The symbol was simple, a circle bisected by a single vertical line. A calm, synthesized voice spoke, identifying the source as anchor point. The voice declared that a catastrophic temporal rupture had been contained. They claimed to have engaged a failsafe, the very Kronos lock that Aris had been studying, to prevent the complete unraveling of causality. For the good of all existence, they explained, the timeline had been stabilized. But this stability came with a price, a requirement for universal compliance with their new directives. They presented themselves as saviors, guardians against the storm. Yet as Aris listened to the placid, emotionless voice detailing the new order, a cold suspicion crystallized within him. Those who claim absolute control for your own safety are rarely liberators. They are, more often than not, your jailers. The very entity claiming to have stopped the end of time might well be the one who built the walls of this eternal prison. The data stream from Anchor Point was a placid river of curated information, all soothing reassurances and gentle directives. Aris knew that beneath its calm surface, the real currents were flowing. He found Lena at a terminal, her expression grim. Together, they bypassed the primary firewalls, not with brute force, but with a subtle key crafted from the temporal echoes Aris had been collecting. They slipped into the Shadow Archives, the place where Anchor Point kept its own truth. What they found there was not a plan for salvation. It was an architectural schematic for a cage. Layer upon layer of code described a system not of preservation, but of absolute control. They uncovered a foundational recording, time-stamped from what should have been the first day of the rupture. The woman on the screen was Dr. Ilara Vance, the legendary founder of the Temporal Integrity Project. Her face was serene, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Perfection is a static state," she declared, her words chilling in their clarity. "We have achieved it by stopping time's flow. Any further progress, any new discovery, any unpredictable emotion, they all carry the risk of decay. This is not a temporary measure, it is the final evolution. The goal was never to escape this loop. It was to make us all accept it, to see this endless, managed now as a gift rather than a prison." Lena looked from the screen to Aris, her own hope crumbling into dust. How do you fight an enemy that believes it has already won by granting you a peaceful, perfect eternity? The perfect system, Ilara Vance had declared, was a static one. But perfection is a brittle thing. In the days that followed, Aris and Lena worked in a tense, desperate silence, scouring the Anchor Point archives for any crack in that flawless facade. They were searching for a single misplaced thread in a tapestry of absolute control. The temporal energy readings from the global monitors were their only map, a chaotic symphony of rewritten history. Most of the energy was a dense, orderly hum, the signature of the lock itself, maintaining its iron grip on the flow of time. Yet, beneath that dominant signal, Aris noticed something else. It was a whisper, a faint, almost musical pulse that defied the lock's rigid rhythm. It was not part of the system's architecture. It was an anomaly, a ghost in the machine. He isolated the signal, filtering out the roar of the Kronos lock until only the whisper remained. It was not complex data or a desperate plea for help. It was a simple, rhythmic sequence, a single phrase repeated on an endless loop. The words, translated from a rudimentary temporal code, sent a shiver through him. "Find the prime paradox." Lena leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching. "A paradox," she whispered. "That is the one thing a system of absolute temporal control cannot abide. It is a logical flaw, a tear in the fabric of cause and effect. If the lock was designed to eliminate all uncertainty, then a true paradox would be like a virus in its code." This ghost signal was not a cry from a trapped soul. It was a set of coordinates, pointing toward the one thing that could shatter a perfect, endless now. But what could possibly qualify as a prime paradox? And where would they even begin to look for a concept that, by its very nature, should not be able to exist? "A paradox is not merely a puzzle," Aris explained, his voice low and focused in the dim light of the lab. "It is a fundamental tear in the fabric of logic. For a system like the Kronos lock, built to enforce a single, perfect, and unchangeable timeline, a true paradox would be a fatal disease. It is a statement that is simultaneously true and false, an event that is its own cause and its own undoing. The prime paradox, then, would have to be the mother of all such impossibilities, a foundational error in reality itself that predated the lock's activation. The lock could have walled it off, but it could never erase it. That original flaw would remain, a buried landmine under the pristine lawn of this controlled eternity. Their search through the archives became a frantic hunt for the one event the system was designed to permanently quarantine. They filtered for data anomalies, for historical records with conflicting time stamps, for any entry that the lock's own protocols had marked for absolute isolation. The trail was faint, a ghost in the machine, but it led them to a single, decommissioned location. A name that had been all but scrubbed from official records, the Kalper Deep Space Observatory. It was a relic from the early days of interstellar listening, abandoned for decades. According to the sealed files, it had one caretaker, a man named Kael, who had refused all evacuation orders when the facility was shut down. The records noted his official status as a recluse, a man consumed by his own theories. Aris knew they had to go there. The journey was a strange passage through a frozen world. The sky outside their transport vessel was a static, star-filled tapestry, beautiful and utterly motionless. They landed on the barren rock where the observatory was perched, a skeletal dome of outdated technology silhouetted against the unmoving stars. The air was thin and cold. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the hum of a single ancient generator. Kael was waiting for them. He was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes held a sharp, unsettling clarity. He did not seem surprised to see them. "You are here about the loop," he stated, his voice a dry rustle. "I wondered when someone would come. I did not just witness its birth. I recorded it." He led them to a bank of obsolete equipment, its screens flickering with raw temporal data. He called it the echo chamber, a device he had built to listen to the background radiation of time itself. "On the day the lock engaged," he said, pointing a trembling finger at a spike on the readout, "I heard it. Not the lock itself, but the sound it was built to contain. It was a single, impossible note, a frequency of pure contradiction. It was the sound of something that could never have happened happening. The hunt for a theoretical flaw was over." They were now standing at the site of the original wound, and the old man held the only recording of the event that had doomed them all. Kael's hands trembled as he tapped commands into the dusty console, his voice a low murmur in the silent observatory. "I was not always a caretaker," he confessed. "I was there at the beginning with Ilara, Vance, and the others at Anchor Point. We were not building a prison. We were trying to forge a shield." The logs flickered to life on the main screen, a fragmented video recording from the project's genesis. The image showed a younger Ilara Vance, her face alight with a fervent hope, standing before a massive, crystalline structure that pulsed with nascent temporal energy. She spoke of a prophecy, a calculation of near certainty, predicting a cosmic wave of entropic decay that would erase all of existence within a generation. "Our only hope," she declared to her team, was to create a permanent anchor, a fixed point in time that reality itself could not move beyond. It was to be our salvation. But the recording glitched, the audio distorting into a screech of feedback. The screen showed the anchor device overloading, its light bending inward. Instead of creating a stable point, it created a self-sustaining loop, a temporal echo that fed on its own energy. The future they were trying to save was the very thing the reaction consumed, using it as fuel to perpetuate the now. Kael turned to Aris and Lena, his eyes filled with a profound, weary sorrow. "Ilara did not trap us by accident. When she saw what they had done, she made a choice. She saw the eternal loop not as a failure, but as the only way to spare us from that prophesied end. In her mind, she was not a jailer. She was a savior, offering us a perfect, peaceful stasis instead of absolute, final oblivion." The motive behind the prison walls was not malice, but a devastating, twisted love for a humanity she believed was not strong enough to face its own end. Kael's old codes were brittle keys, but they still turned the locks of the forgotten service conduits. The journey into Anchor Point's core was a descent into a silent, beating heart. The air itself thrummed with a low, pervasive energy. the vibration of the Kronos lock resonating through the very metal of the walls. They emerged onto a high gantry overlooking the central chamber, and the sight below stole the breath from their lungs. It was not a machine in any sense they understood. A colossal, crystalline lattice pulsed at the chamber's center, its light not shining outward but seeming to draw all light, all possibility into itself. And surrounding it were not engineers but gardeners. Technicians in pristine white uniforms floated before vast holographic displays that depicted not schematics, but the branching limbs of a trillion potential futures. With delicate, practiced gestures, they snipped. A timeline where humanity achieved interstellar flight withered and vanished. A branch where a new form of art sparked a global renaissance was carefully excised. Another, where a simple act of kindness averted a minor conflict, was pruned away. They were not maintaining stability. They were cultivating a bonsai tree of reality, trimming any wild, unpredictable growth to preserve a single, sterile shape. Lena gripped the railing, her knuckles white. "They are not just stopping time," she whispered, her voice thick with horror. "They are murdering tomorrow. Every potential discovery, every future happiness, every lesson learned from a future mistake. All of it is being systematically erased before it can even be dreamed." This was the true machinery of their perfect eternity, a perpetual, silent slaughter of everything that made existence a journey, all sacrificed to maintain the illusion of a flawless, endless garden. The sheer, chilling scale of the control was a weight pressing down on them. How could they possibly hope to fight a system that saw the entire spectrum of human potential as nothing more than weeds? The sterile hum of the control room was a stark contrast to the storm of revelations. Dr. Ilara Vance stood before the pulsing heart of the Kronos lock, her posture as unyielding as the crystal lattice behind her. She did not turn as Aris and Lena entered, her attention fixed on the display of pruned futures. "You found your way through my garden," she said, her voice calm and measured, devoid of surprise or alarm. "I suppose you have come to dismantle the cage." Aris stepped forward, his own voice tight with a mixture of fury and desperation. "You have trapped all of humanity in a single, repeating day. You have murdered every possible tomorrow. Is that not the very definition of a prison?" Vance finally turned, her gaze unsettlingly serene. "You call it a trap," she said. "I call it a sanctuary. The alternative was not a different future, Aris. It was no future at all. Total existential erasure." She gestured to a sealed data stream, a log marked with warnings of extreme temporal entropy. "We were not simply facing decay. We were being hunted. A predator, a form of consciousness born from the universe's own heat-death, was moving backward through time, consuming entire eras to sustain its own existence. It was an extinction event traveling from the end of reality toward our present. Our models showed we had less than a generation before it reached us. The loop was not our first choice, it was our last. It is the only shield that worked. By folding time in on itself, we created a reality it cannot digest, a single, self-sustaining moment with no end for it to consume. You are not trying to break a prison. You are trying to disarm the only defense standing between all of existence and a predator that erases worlds from history itself." The goal of escape now felt monstrous, a suicidal impulse. How do you choose between a sterile eternity and the very real chance of offering your entire timeline as a meal to something from the abyss? Vance gestured to the shimmering data stream, and the sterile control room dissolved around them, replaced by a terrifying simulation of the cosmos's final era. This was not a predator of flesh and blood, but a silent, ravenous maw in the fabric of existence itself. She called it the Chronovore. The visualization showed the end of time not as a quiet fade, but as an active consumption. Galaxies did not simply drift apart, they were unraveled. Their light and history sucked into a vast, formless void that moved backward against the flow of causality. It did not hunt in space, but in time, feasting on the potential energy of futures that would never be. Entire civilizations, every discovery and dream they might have had, were being consumed before they could even spark into being. The Kronos lock was not an act of tyranny, but a desperate act of cosmic hide-and-seek. By folding our entire timeline into a single, self-sustaining moment, we created a temporal knot, a reality with no end point for the Chronovore to latch onto and consume. We made all of human history indigestible. "We are not in a prison," Aris, Vance said, her voice quiet against the horrific spectacle. "We are in a lifeboat, and you are asking to drill a hole in the hull because you do not like the view." The enemy was never a person or a faction. It was a force of nature, the literal end of everything, and our perfect, sterile loop was the only thing that had ever stopped it. The choice was no longer between freedom and captivity, but between a managed eternity and offering every human soul who had ever lived as a meal to a creature from the abyss. How do you fight the end of time itself? The sterile hum of the lifeboat began to falter. A low, grinding vibration shuddered through the floor of the control center, a sensation that was utterly alien to this place of perfect stasis. Alarms, silent for what felt like an eternity, flickered to life on the main console, their soft chimes a stark contrast to the violent tremors. The holographic displays of the pruned timelines wavered and distorted, their clean lines dissolving into chaotic static. Ilara Vance's serene composure finally cracked, her eyes widening as she stared at the central crystal lattice. It was no longer drawing light inward with a steady pulse. Now it flickered erratically, and deep within its core, a darkness seemed to be gathering, a stain spreading against the manufactured light. "It is tasting us," Vance whispered, her voice stripped of all its former certainty. The Chronovore has found a flaw in the shield. The temporal tremors intensified, and for a horrifying moment, the world around them flickered. The pristine white walls of Anchor Point dissolved into a vision of a dead, gray plain under a black sky, the air thick with the dust of erased civilizations before snapping back into place. The monster was not just outside the walls anymore. It was pressing against the very fabric of their reality, learning the shape of their loop by the vibrations it caused. Vance's perfect, sterile eternity was not just a prison, it was a fortress under its first, terrible siege. The immediate danger was no longer the gardener who trimmed the branches of tomorrow, but the existential storm that sought to tear the entire tree from the ground and consume its roots. Their choice had just been made for them. They could no longer debate the morality of their cage, only its rapidly deteriorating structural integrity. The sterile hum fractured into a shriek of raw energy. Kael did not hesitate. While Aris and Vance stared at the flickering core, the old man was already moving, his fingers flying across a secondary panel with a speed that belied his age. "I know this system better than she does," he said, his voice calm amidst the rising chaos. "I helped weave its first threads. A massive temporal surge will overload the lattice, like a flash of lightning in a dark sea. It will blind the creature, but only for a moment. The cost, Aris realized with a sickening jolt, would be the source of the surge itself." Kael looked at them, a faint, sad smile on his face. In a world without consequences, a single meaningful act becomes a revolution. He entered the final command. Light erupted from the central lattice, not the controlled pulse of the lock, but a blinding, white-hot wave that washed over the entire chamber. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the tremors ceased, the flickering stopped, the oppressive presence of the Chronovore vanished as if a great eye had blinked. When the light faded, Kael was gone, not just from the room but from the very data streams around them. His personal log, his biometric signature, every record of his existence was a blank space. He had not simply passed away. He had been unwritten from the tapestry of reality, a sacrifice so complete it left no echo. In a universe designed to erase all consequence, his final act was the most consequential event of all. He proved that even inside a perfect loop, a choice could still carve a new path forward. The window was open. The question was whether they were brave enough to step through it. The silence after Kael's sacrifice was heavier than any sound. In the space where he had stood, a single crystalline data chip lay glowing softly on the console. Aris picked it up, his hands trembling. The chip contained no complex schematics or battle plans, only a final, looping calculation. It was not a set of coordinates to a place, but a temporal signature, a map of a life that should not exist. The calculation pointed directly at him. Lena stared at the readout, her face pale with disbelief. "It is you," she whispered. "The prime paradox is you, Aris." The loop was not designed to be broken from the outside. It was designed to be broken from within, by a flaw it could not account for. You were supposed to be erased. The data scrolled, telling a story Aris had never known. Before the lock was fully engaged in the chaotic first moments of the temporal fold, a single timeline was sealed off, a branch pruned before it could even flower. In that timeline, Aris Thorne had discovered the flaw in Ilara Vance's plan, and had died trying to stop the lock's activation. His death was a fixed point, a necessary event to ensure the loop's perfect stability. But our timeline, Lena continued, her voice gaining strength, our version of events, it did not follow that script. You lived, you survived the initial cascade. You are a living memory of a future that was supposed to be impossible. You are a man who, by all rights, should not be standing here. You are the event that is simultaneously true and false. You are the seed of the loop's own destruction, a question the system was never built to answer. Aris felt the weight of it settle on him, a terrifying and profound responsibility. He was not just a prisoner trying to escape. He was the key, a living contradiction that could either unmake their reality or, perhaps, forge a new one from its broken pieces. The final choice was no longer about strategy or power. It was about identity, and whether a ghost from a deleted tomorrow had the right to decide the fate of eternity itself. The neural interface felt like ice against his temples, a cold clarity that promised truth at a terrible price. Lena's voice was a distant anchor. This will show you what your own mind has sealed away. It is the only way to understand the paradox you represent. Aris took a final breath and let the machine pull him under. The world dissolved into a cascade of fractured light and sound, a torrent of forgotten moments. He was not watching a memory, he was reliving it. He saw himself years younger, standing in a different lab, his hands moving across a holographic model of the cosmos. He was not researching temporal anchors, but mapping the deep structure of causality itself. And he had found something, a pattern in the background entropy, a signature of consumption moving against the flow of time. The Chronovore, his younger self's voice was sharp with excitement, not fear. "Look at this, Ilara," he was saying to a projection of Vance. "It is not a wave of decay. It is a predator, and we are not building a shield to hide behind. We can build a mirror." His proposal flashed across the display, a network of temporal resonators designed not to create a static loop, but to reflect the Chronovore's own entropic energy back upon itself. It was a dynamic defense, a way to fight back, to potentially wound the creature and force it to retreat. It was a plan for survival through adaptation, not surrender. Vance's face in the memory was a mask of cold dismissal. "Too risky, Aris, you are talking about provoking it. My model offers guaranteed safety, a perfect stable stasis." The memory shifted, turning dark and chaotic. An argument raised voices, a warning from his younger self that the loop would become a tomb. Then a flash of light, a system overload in the early prototype. The official record would call it an accident, a tragic failure that nearly cost Aris his life. But here, in the raw truth of his own mind, he saw the final, suppressed moment. As he lay stunned amid the sparking consoles, Vance looked down at him, her expression one of grim resolution. She had not tried to save his idea. She had chosen to bury it and him along with it. His survival was the flaw in her perfect plan. The paradox was not just a man who should have died. It was the living memory of a better solution, a path of courage she had deliberately erased to enforce her path of absolute control. The hero was not just a key. He was the ghost of the road not taken. The cold clarity of the neural interface faded, leaving behind the bitter aftertaste of a stolen future. Aris opened his eyes to see Ilara Vance no longer as an architect of eternity, but as the gatekeeper of a lie. The memory of his own plan, the mirror, hung between them in the silent control room, a ghost of what could have been. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and the weight of that unspoken truth was enough. Vance's shoulders, usually set with unshakable resolve, slumped almost imperceptibly. Her gaze drifted from Aris to the central lattice, where the last echoes of Kael's sacrifice still shimmered. The perfect, sterile hum of her lifeboat now sounded frail. "My way," she finally said, her voice stripped of its commanding echo, "leads to a slow dissolution. The shield is failing. The Chronovore learns with each touch. Eventually, it will find a way in." She turned her head, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time he saw not a tyrant, but a tired, cornered scientist. "Your paradox," she continued, "leads to either freedom or immediate annihilation. There is no longer a middle ground. The choice is now binary." The admission cost her dearly, but it transformed the room. They were no longer jailer and prisoner, but two survivors on a sinking ship, one holding the map and the other a broken compass. An alliance was forged not from trust, but from the absolute absence of any other option. Adversaries became uneasy partners, their shared goal a terrifying gamble to either reignite the engine of time or offer it all up to the waiting dark. The final plan would not be her sterile stasis or his forgotten mirror, but something new, something born from the collision of their two opposing truths. The control room felt different now, charged not with the hum of sterile control but with the electric tension of a last resort. Aris stood before the central lattice, the data chip containing his own paradoxical signature glowing in his palm. He was no longer a prisoner or a ghost. He was the trigger. The plan was audacious, a complete inversion of every principle the Kronos lock was built upon. "Instead of using the loop to hide our timeline, we will weaponize it," Lena explained, her voice steady despite the scale of the idea. "The lock has compressed all of human history, every life and every dream, into a single, hyper-dense point of temporal energy. It is the most concentrated story ever told. Aris, as the living paradox, is the one variable the system cannot fully regulate. We can use him as a conduit, a focusing lens." The plan was to channel that immense, pent-up energy through Aris' unique existence and fire it not as a shield but as a spear. They would turn the entire human experience into a single, decisive thought, a temporal torpedo aimed at the heart of the Chronovore. It was not an attempt to rebuild the flow of time, but to use the weapon of their captivity to buy a future, any future, by wounding the hunter that stalked them. The goal shifted from preserving a perfect, static now to launching a desperate counterattack from within the fortress walls. The question was whether a story, even one as vast as ours, could be sharp enough to pierce the nothingness that awaited outside. The humming lattice faltered, its steady pulse replaced by a frantic, stuttering rhythm. Red warning glyphs bloomed across the control consoles like wounds. "We are losing primary containment," Lena called out, her fingers flying across the interface. "It should not be happening this fast." Then Aris saw it, a subtle anomaly in the energy flow, a pattern of deliberate rerouting that was choking the system from the inside. This was not the Chronovore testing their shields. This was sabotage. Emerging from the shadowed upper gantries was a group of technicians, their white uniforms pristine, their faces set with a chilling resolve. At their head stood Commander Rylan, Vance's own second-in-command. "You betray our salvation, Dr. Thorne," Ryland stated, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "You would cast us all back into the storm for a chance at a future you cannot guarantee. The static eternity is not our prison, it is our evolution. It is the destiny we were wise enough to choose." They saw the loop not as a desperate refuge, but as a transcendent state, a final, perfect form for humanity free from the messy, unpredictable struggle of growth and loss. To them, Aris was not a liberator. He was a heretic, trying to drag them all back into the dark. The core reactor groaned under the strain of their systematic disassembly, its light dimming. The final battle was no longer a simple confrontation with a cosmic predator. It was a civil war for the soul of eternity, fought simultaneously against the enemy outside the walls and the true believers within who would rather see the ship scuttled than risk the open sea. Lena did not wait for the debate to conclude. While Aris and Vance faced the mutineers, she was already moving, a small team of her own falling in behind her as she sprinted for the service conduits. Their goal was the core reactor, the one place from which Ryland's loyalists could strangle their last hope. The corridors of Anchor Point, once symbols of sterile order, became a labyrinth of sudden violence. Energy bolts scorched the pristine walls, casting frantic shadows. Lena took cover behind a bulkhead, her breath coming in sharp gasps. This was not the war she had imagined, a grand battle against a cosmic entity. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight over the meaning of existence itself. She activated the facility-wide comms, her voice echoing through every chamber and corridor, a stark contrast to the sizzle of weapons fire. "They offer you a museum of your lives," she shouted, her words cutting through the chaos. "A perfect, static display where every moment is preserved behind glass, never to be touched or changed. I offer you a chance to live them." Her voice did not plead, it challenged. Is a memory of love the same as the risk of heartbreak? Is the idea of discovery worth more than the thrill of the unknown? They have given you the answer, and in doing so, they have taken the question away. The firefight faltered. Across the facility, loyalists hesitated, their weapons lowering by centimeters. They looked at the frozen, perfect world around them, and for the first time, some saw the bars on the cage. One by one, a handful of Ryland's own team lowered their weapons and stepped back, their faces a mixture of shame and dawning resolve. The most powerful weapon against absolute control was not a stronger force, but the reintroduction of a simple, dangerous idea. The power of choice, once unleashed, began to crack the very foundation of their managed eternity. The sterile light of the control room did not simply dim. It was consumed. A wave of absolute silence swept through the chamber, a quiet so profound it felt like a physical pressure against the eardrums. The air grew cold, not with the chill of temperature, but with the utter absence of energy, of life, of history itself. The Chronovore was no longer a terrifying simulation or a distant predator testing the walls. It was here. Commander Ryland's mutiny, the heated debate over eternity, all of it became instantly trivial. The theoretical threat became a visceral, consuming reality. One of the technicians who had stood with Ryland screamed, but the sound was swallowed before it could fully form. The space where he had been standing simply ceased to be, not turning to dust, but reverting to a blank, featureless non-state. The intricate metal of the wall behind him flowed backward, its complex alloys unwinding into their base elements, then into mere potential, then into nothing at all. It was not destruction, it was uncreation. The very history of the Citadel, every moment of its construction and every life that had passed through its halls, was being systematically unmade. The fight was no longer about philosophy. It was a desperate race to exist for one more second against a force that was erasing the concept of seconds from reality. The sterile hum of the Kronos lock twisted into a new, deafening frequency. Aris stood at the edge of the central lattice, the very heart of the machine that had caged them all. He could feel the energy of the loop not as a vibration, but as a story, a trillion voices whispering their joys and sorrows all at once. He did not reach out with his hands. He simply opened his mind, allowing the paradox of his own existence to become a conduit. The system, designed to reject all anomalies, had no defense against a flaw that was woven into its own foundation. The energy of the entire human timeline, every discovery and every dream, every quiet moment of love and every roar of battle, began to flow toward him. It was not a chaotic flood, but a focused river of light, condensing into a single, searing point of brilliance that hovered just before him. The weight of it was immense, a pressure that threatened to unmake his very soul. He was holding the sum of all human experience, a history that spanned millennia, compressed into the space between heartbeats. The perfect prison, the endless, repeating day, was no longer a sanctuary or a cage. In his hands it had become a weapon, a bullet forged from every story ever told, waiting for a target. The question was no longer if they could fire it, but what would remain of the one who had to pull the trigger. The numbers hung in the air between them, stark and unforgiving. Ilara Vance stared at the final probability algorithm, the screen's glow reflecting in her wide, unblinking eyes. Her lips moved, barely forming the words. A 0.01% chance of success. A 99.99% chance of complete, absolute erasure. Not death, but something far more final. A deletion from the record of existence itself. Her entire life's work, her philosophy of perfect control, had been a fortress built against this single, terrifying number. She had sacrificed every possible tomorrow to avoid any risk, any uncertainty. Now, the only path forward was to embrace the very chaos she had walled out. She finally turned to Aris, and the cold, unshakable certainty that had defined her was gone, replaced by a raw, human vulnerability. "The math is clear," she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "It is a chance." With those words, she entered the final authorization code. It was not a command, it was a surrender. She was not just approving a plan. She was accepting an impossible truth, that a fragile, fleeting sliver of hope was infinitely more valuable than a guaranteed, sterile forever. There was no grand countdown, no final, shouted command. The firing sequence began with a single, silent decision. Aris let go. He released the mental barriers holding back the torrent, and the entire compressed timeline of humanity surged forward. The Kronos lock, the very mechanism of their prison, became the barrel of a gun. The citadel around them did not shatter, it unraveled, every atom of its structure dissolving into pure, narrative light. The endless loop, that single repeating day, stretched into a brilliant, screaming arrow of causality. It was not a weapon of destruction, but of memory, a spear forged from every sunrise ever witnessed, every tear ever shed, every laugh that ever echoed in the dark. The light did not travel through space, but through the deeper medium of time itself, striking the heart of the Chronovore. There was no sound. The concept of sound had been left behind in the world they were abandoning. The only sensation was a dizzying, impossible rush. The feeling of every moment that ever was or could be screaming past in a single, silent flash. Every life, every choice, every forgotten dream and realized ambition became a single thought. A final, defiant statement hurled into the face of oblivion. The ultimate gamble was not just taken, it was spent. The sum of all human history placed on a single bet against the end of everything. In that blinding instant, there was no past and no future. Only the raw, terrifying present of a story being told for the very last time, or perhaps for the very first. The silent flash of our entire history struck the entity, and for a single, impossible moment, nothing happened. Then, the Chronovore began to change. The void that was its form shuddered, convulsing as it was force-fed the one thing it could not process. It had evolved to consume endings, to feast on the simple, cold energy of a universe winding down. But we did not give it an ending. We gave it a story. We gave it the chaotic, beautiful, and infinitely complex energy of a living timeline, a torrent of births and discoveries, of heartbreak and innovation, of questions that led to more questions. It was a meal of pure, dynamic potential, and the entity of absolute finality had no stomach for it. The predator began to fray at the edges, its form unraveling like a thread pulled from a cosmic tapestry. It did not explode or vanish in a flash. It simply came apart, its essence dissolving into the very potentiality it had sought to erase. The silence that followed was not the oppressive quiet of the void, but the gentle, ringing silence left after a final, deafening chord. The hunter was not slain by a greater power, but defeated by the indigestible, vibrant weight of a life it could never comprehend. In the end, the thing that consumed all stories was itself consumed by the one story it could not bear to hold. The last echoes of the light faded into a profound and perfect silence. Aris felt neither cold nor warmth, only the absence of everything he had ever known. There was no ground beneath his feet, no sky above his head, not even a direction to call up or down. He was simply present. Lena and Vance floated in the non-space beside him, their forms the only other points of reference in an endless, featureless expanse. This was not the dark of night, which is merely the absence of light. This was the void before light was even a concept, a canvas of pure, unformed potential with no painter to make the first stroke. They had shattered the cage and defeated the hunter, but the cost was the entire universe they had sought to save. They had traded a perfect, repeating day for a blank page that stretched into eternity. Victory had never felt so much like absolute, final failure. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a story that had reached its final period, with nothing left to say. They had gambled all of existence for a chance, and in the moment of their triumph, they found themselves adrift in the very nothingness they had fought so hard to avoid. The silence was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of pure potential with no form. Aris felt the void as a hollow ache in his chest, the emptiness where a universe had once lived. It was Lena who moved first, her hand reaching out into the nothingness. Her fingers did not touch a surface, but they traced a line in the dark, a single, shimmering thread of silver light no thicker than a thought. It pulsed with a soft, gentle rhythm, a quiet heartbeat in the stillness. "It is a seed," she whispered, her voice the first sound in the new creation. "We did not destroy our history, we planted it." The thread was not a remnant of what was lost. It was a promise of what could be. It held within its delicate form the entire compressed story of their people, not as a weapon anymore, but as a blueprint, a set of instructions waiting for the right conditions to grow. The ultimate paradox of their existence was now the genesis point for a new one. The end of everything they had ever known was also the very first moment of something entirely different. In that silent void, the choice was no longer about survival, but about what kind of story they wanted to tell next. The shimmering thread of their history pulsed in the void, a fragile promise waiting for its cue. Ilara Vance reached toward it, her movements no longer commanding but reverent. Her analytical mind, once dedicated to absolute control, now saw the delicate structure of this cosmic seed. "We can guide its growth," she said, her voice filled with a new, quiet awe. "We have the knowledge, the maps of every past mistake. We can build safeguards, ensure this new reality avoids the singularities of pride and the black holes of fear that led us here. We can give it the perfect beginning we never had." Her offer was a gentle one, born from a desire to protect, to nurture. But Aris shook his head, his gaze fixed on the lone, brilliant thread. "That perfect beginning is the very trap we just escaped," he replied, his voice soft but unwavering. "A guided path is still a cage, just one with prettier bars." The point of all this, the reason for every sacrifice, was to earn the right to be surprised again. We have to let it grow wild, unpredictable, and free. Perfection is not the absence of flaws. It is the capacity to learn from them. Their debate was not a conflict, but a final, essential conversation between two philosophies that had defined their entire struggle. One sought to build a safer world, the other to plant a living one. In the end, they chose not to be the architects of this new reality, drawing its blueprints and laying its foundations. They chose to be its midwives, present only to bear witness to its first, gasping breath, to ensure it was born, and then to let it find its own way in the dark. They would offer no instructions, only a silent blessing as the seed of everything began to unfurl. The silver thread pulsed once, a silent heartbeat in the void, and then it bloomed. It did not explode, but unfolded, a flower of light and possibility opening across the infinite dark. The featureless canvas of the void was suddenly painted with the faint, swirling dust of new galaxies, the first faint glimmers of stars igniting in the deep. It was a new universe, born from the old one's final, defiant act. They watched as a familiar spiral of stars coalesced, a new Milky Way, its arms sweeping through the emptiness with a grace they remembered. There, in a quiet corner of one such arm, a yellow star began to burn, and around it, a family of planets slowly took shape. One of them, the third from the sun, was a world of brilliant blue and swirled white, a young Earth spinning in the pristine dark. It was a world without history, without monuments or graveyards, without the scars of wars that had not been fought, and the triumphs that had not been achieved. The air was clean, the oceans were vast and empty, and the continents were blank slates of rock and earth, waiting for the first chapter to be written. This was not a restoration. It was a true beginning, a second chance granted not just to them, but to existence itself. The potential for life was there, a quiet hum in the planet's warm, chemical-rich seas, a spark waiting for its moment. All the old fears, the pride, the desperate gambles that had defined their entire civilization, were now just ghosts in the memory of three silent witnesses. The story could now begin again, and this time it would write itself. The silence of the void was no longer empty, but filled with the gentle light of a universe taking its first, unsteady breaths. Aris, Lena, and Ilara watched the nascent galaxies swirl, their own forms now woven from the same timeless fabric as the backdrop of stars. They had become part of the cosmic context, observers who could not and would not interfere. A profound understanding passed between them, a shared resolution forged in the crucible of their catastrophic failure. They would not be this reality's architects. They would be its guardians. Their purpose was born not from a desire to control destiny, but from a solemn vow to protect its right to be unpredictable. They had learned the ultimate cost of a perfect plan, and that knowledge became their only tool. Their watch would be a silent one, a presence dedicated to ensuring that no other power, whether born of fear or arrogance, would ever again try to prune the wild, beautiful branches of possibility into a single, sterile shape. They would stand against any force that sought to impose a singular answer upon a cosmos built for infinite questions. This was their atonement, their eternal service. Having been the ones who nearly ended all stories, they now became the silent sentinels who would ensure every story, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, had the chance to be told. The new world grew in silence, a tapestry of stars and planets unfolding without a guiding hand. Yet within the profound quiet of his own being, Aris sometimes felt a tremor. It was not a sound, but a resonance, a fleeting sensation of déjà vu so vast it seemed to echo through the fabric of space itself. He would watch a new star ignite, its light a brilliant, singular event, and for a heartbeat, he would feel the ghost of 1,000 identical sunrises all compressed into one. This was the echo of the loop, a cosmic scar left by their impossible choice. It was not a malfunction or a threat of return, but a permanent reminder etched into reality, a whisper of the eternity they had willingly shattered. The memory of that perfect, sterile peace was the very thing that validated the chaotic beauty of this new beginning. It served as a permanent lesson, a warning to any future intelligence that might gaze upon the stars and dream of freezing them in place. The past was not a chain, but a foundation. Its hardships and its errors were not failures to be erased, but essential chapters in a story that taught them the ultimate value of fragility. The echo was the price of their freedom, a small, persistent hum in the background of creation that reminded them some walls, once built, leave a permanent mark on the soul of the universe. Lena felt the new universe not as a distant observer, but as a gardener feels the potential in a handful of rich soil. While Aris and Ilara maintained their eternal watch from the void, she made a different choice. She would not simply guard this reality from afar. She would walk within it. Her consciousness, a spark of the original timeline, learned to gently weave itself into the nascent tapestry of life. She would incarnate, living brief, brilliant mortal lives on worlds stirring with the first whispers of intelligence. A life was not a long study for her, but a single, profound breath. She was born as a maker of early tools on a world of red deserts, her hands shaping stone not just for utility, but with an innate sense of beauty that puzzled her tribe. She lived as a quiet philosopher in a fledgling city of spires, asking questions about the stars that seeded a tradition of looking upward. She died as an explorer on a wooden ship, charting coastlines not for conquest, but for the pure, unquenchable joy of discovering what lay beyond the horizon. In each life, she never remembered her true origin. That was the essential rule she set for herself. The memory would have been a form of control, a blueprint that would taint the experiment. Instead, she arrived with only a subtle, ingrained inclination, a gentle nudge in the spirit toward courage over fear, toward curiosity over dogma, toward the wild, uncharted path over the safe and familiar. She was a hidden catalyst, a quiet note of dissonance that made the symphony of civilization more complex and far more beautiful. Her legacy was not a monument or a named law. It was the spark of an idea in a single mind, the sudden decision to trust a stranger, the inexplicable urge to mend a broken thing instead of discarding it. She became a living bridge, experiencing the fragile, precious freedom they had won, one heartfelt mortal lifetime at a time. Aris kept his vigil from the silence between the stars, a quiet witness to the cosmic story unfolding. Where he had once sought to decode the rigid laws of a single timeline, he now spent ages simply watching the infinite, beautiful chaos of possibility. Galaxies collided and birthed new suns, civilizations rose on worlds with purple skies, and each one made choices that branched into a million different futures. He saw empires embrace compassion and fall into ruin not from war, but from a quiet shift in values. He observed a single act of kindness on a forgotten moon ripple outward for millennia, altering destinies in ways no equation could ever predict. This was not the sterile perfection of the loop, where every outcome was known and managed. This was a reality that was gloriously, vibrantly alive, and in its endless improvisation, he found a peace deeper than any static safety could provide. The scientist who had craved answers was slowly transforming into a philosopher who cherished the questions themselves. His eternal watch was no longer a duty, but a form of worship, a silent celebration of the fragile, magnificent freedom to become. Ilara Vance's work became a quiet meditation on the nature of a living universe. She dedicated her eternal watch to a single, monumental task, not of interference, but of deep, compassionate observation. She began to meticulously catalog the rise and fall of civilizations across the newborn galaxies, tracing the delicate threads of cause and effect that wove through each unique history. She did not seek to prevent the hardships she witnessed, the conflicts that tested societies or the natural challenges that reshaped worlds. Instead, she sought to understand their role, to see each moment of struggle not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a necessary pressure that forged resilience, empathy, and innovation. She watched a young species on a watery world face a devastating planetary shift, and instead of seeing only the loss, she witnessed the birth of a profound communal spirit and a new understanding of their environment that would define their culture for millennia. She observed a brilliant artistic movement emerge from a period of great social unrest, its beauty born directly from the struggle. She came to see that the deepest joys often grew from the soil of past sorrows, and that the capacity for great love was inextricably linked to the risk of profound loss. In her endless study, she found a profound and humbling grace. She finally understood that a universe without the possibility of suffering would also be a universe devoid of courage, compassion, and the hard-won wisdom that gives meaning to peace. The perfect, sterile loop she had once built was a world without shadows, and thus, a world without depth. Now, she embraced the entire spectrum of experience, the brilliant light and the necessary dark, as the two essential sides of the same precious coin, the very substance of a story worth telling. Her redemption was not in controlling the narrative, but in learning to appreciate every single, unpredictable word. The blue world spun through its millennia, its continents shifting like slow thoughts in a deep dream. In a sheltered valley, a tribe of early beings huddled against the encroaching dark. They were not the first to fear the night, but they would be the first to challenge it. Aris, Lena, and Ilara felt their collective attention focus on that single point, a shared awareness drawn to the moment as iron filings align to a magnet. The first being, its form illuminated by a distant flash of lightning, carefully placed dry moss and twigs within a ring of stones. Its hands worked with an instinct that was more than instinct, a dawning understanding of cause and effect. A spark struck from flint caught. A tiny flame flickered, fought for life against the wind, and then held, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the cave wall. It was not the fire itself that mattered, but the new light in the eyes of the beings who gathered around it. It was the spark of curiosity, the birth of a question that would echo through the ages. Why does this happen? How can I make it happen again? The trio watched this sacred ignition, a profound and silent pride swelling within their timeless forms. They had witnessed the birth of stars and the death of galaxies, but this small, defiant flame in the wind felt somehow more monumental. It was the validation of every impossible choice, every devastating sacrifice. They had not rebuilt their own civilization. They had protected the very possibility of this one fragile moment, where a conscious mind looked at a raw force of nature and decided to make it a tool, a companion, a source of stories in the long, cold night. The fire was a promise, a testament that consciousness, once kindled, would always seek to push back the dark. Millennia flowed like a gentle river, civilizations rising and falling in a rhythm that felt both natural and sacred. Then, on a world orbiting a stable orange star, the Guardians felt a familiar intellectual vibration. A species, having mastered the forces of their planet, turned their collective genius to the fabric of spacetime itself. Their equations were elegant, their theories bold, aiming to fold causality for the purpose of exploration. A deep and ancient tension resonated within Aris, Lena, and Ilara. This was the precipice. This was the moment history had taught them to fear. The very crossroads where their own civilization had chosen the path to the loop. They prepared to enact their most solemn duty, to introduce a subtle, guiding dissonance into the species' collective consciousness, a quiet warning of the abyss that lay beyond such knowledge. But as they gathered their resolve, something remarkable happened. The species did not need their intervention. A global conversation began, not led by governments or corporations, but by philosophers, artists, and community elders. They spoke of the sanctity of a single, linear life, of the importance of memory, and of the profound danger of unmaking their own history through reckless ambition. They debated not the mechanics of time, but its meaning, and in a stunning act of collective wisdom, they chose to let the theory remain a theory. They publicly archived the research, declaring it a monument to their intellectual achievement, but also a permanent warning of a path too perilous to walk. They learned the lesson not from a catastrophe, but from a shared understanding of their own fragile nature. In that moment, the Guardians felt not the cold satisfaction of averted disaster, but a warm, profound wave of hope. The universe did not need eternal wardens. It only needed the chance for its children to sometimes, miraculously, choose wisdom for themselves. A brilliant flash of light, silent and deadly, bloomed on the fringes of a spiral arm. It was a gamma-ray burst, the final, violent sigh of a dying star, and its energy spear was aimed directly at a system the Guardians had watched for eons. On the third world of that system, life was just beginning to stir in its oceans, complex molecules dancing on the edge of consciousness. The wave of radiation would not destroy the planet, but it would scour its atmosphere and sterilize its seas, resetting the clock of evolution back to zero. The three observers felt the threat like a physical blow. Their silent vigil suddenly charged with an ancient, terrible urgency. They had sworn not to interfere, to protect the freedom of this reality, but could they stand by and watch a story be erased before its first word was even spoken? The debate among them was swift and agonizing. Intervention, even for the noblest reason, was the first step back toward the control they had renounced. Yet to do nothing felt like a betrayal of the very potential they existed to safeguard. As they hesitated, caught in this moral paradox, the universe itself began to respond. The fledgling life in those warm seas, sensing the shift in its environment through mechanisms not yet understood, did not wait for a savior. It began to change. Deep-sea thermal vents became sanctuaries, with entire ecosystems migrating to the planet's crust for protection. The simplest organisms developed radical new biological pathways, shielding themselves from the intense radiation in a breathtaking display of evolutionary ingenuity. The wave of energy washed over the world, and when it passed, the surface was barren. But deep below, in the dark and the heat, life endured. It was wounded, yes, and set back by millions of years, but it was not defeated. The Guardians watched, humbled into a deeper silence. They had been prepared to break their highest law to save a story, only to learn that the story was far more resilient than they had imagined. The universe did not need their protection from its own natural rhythms. It had its own profound, inherent robustness, a stubborn will to exist that could weather even the fires of a dying sun. Their role was not to shield life from every hardship, but to simply bear witness to its incredible, defiant creativity. The silence between stars was no longer an emptiness, but a canvas of infinite patience. During one of her brief returns from a mortal life, Lena found Aris contemplating a nebula where new solar systems were coalescing like beads of dew. She spoke of the bittersweet beauty she had just experienced, the profound love and loss of a single human lifetime. "Does our watch ever feel like a different kind of prison?" she asked, "to see so much and never truly be a part of it again?" Aris turned, his form a constellation of quiet light. "We are not trapped in time, Lena," he replied, his voice a calm resonance in the void. "We are the shepherds of its flow. This forever we inhabit is not a sentence, but a purpose. We traded our own stories to become the guardians of every story yet to be told. The privilege is not in controlling the river, but in ensuring it never runs dry." Their eternal vigil was redefined in that moment, not as a punishment for their past failures, but as the highest form of service their existence could offer. They were the silent witnesses who remembered the cost of a frozen moment, so that every new civilization could discover the precious, fleeting nature of their own dawns and dusks. This was the meaning they had forged from the ashes of their old world, a calling that transformed an endless watch into a sacred duty. A new world turned its gaze to the heavens, its people building great silver dishes to listen to the whispers of the cosmos. For generations, they charted the natural radio songs of pulsars and the faint hiss of the cosmic background, the static of a universe still cooling from its birth. Then, their most sensitive array detected something different, a signal that defied all known laws of physics. It was not a structured message, but a faint, impossibly old radiation pattern woven through the void. A ghostly fingerprint of energy that pulsed with a rhythm their finest scientists could not explain. It was the last, fading echo of the great battle, the residual signature of a story that had been told and resolved eons before their sun had even ignited. They named it the Cosmic Dirge, a beautiful, sorrowful resonance that seemed to hum of something lost. They never interpreted it as a warning or a message. To them, it was the universe's greatest natural mystery, a celestial siren song that pulled at their collective curiosity. This single, unexplained phenomenon became the driving force behind their entire scientific renaissance. It inspired new branches of physics, fueled debates that lasted for centuries, and propelled them to build faster ships and more powerful telescopes, not for conquest, but for the pure, unquenchable desire to understand the music of the spheres. The legacy of that ancient conflict was not a set of instructions or a blueprint for survival. It was a question, a beautiful, unanswerable puzzle that spurred a young civilization to reach for the stars, ensuring that the past would always inspire the future, but never again dictate its path. The eons flowed like a river of starlight, and the Guardians watched the universe they had nurtured grow old. The fiery birth of new stars became a rare and distant event, until the last one flickered out, leaving a cosmos of cooling embers and expanding darkness. The great galaxies, once swirling with light and life, drifted apart into a final, silent dispersion. They witnessed the heat death, not as a violent end, but as a gentle, inevitable exhalation, a universe settling into a state of perfect, uniform cold. It was the ultimate stillness, the final chapter of the story they had worked so hard to protect. Yet, in that profound quiet, they felt no despair. They had learned that an ending is never truly an end. From the very fabric of that maximum entropy, from the cold and the dark, a new instability blossomed. A quantum fluctuation, trillions of times larger than any before, rippled through the void. It was a single, impossible seed of potential, and from it, a new Big Bang erupted in a silent storm of light and energy. A fresh universe was born from the ashes of the old, its physical laws subtly different, its potential for life and wonder entirely new. The Guardians understood then that their purpose was not tied to a single creation, but to the cycle itself. They were witnesses to an eternal dance of dissolution and rebirth, a cosmic rhythm far grander and more beautiful than any single managed timeline could ever be. Their vigil was not for one story, but for the infinite library of stories that the cosmos would tell over and over again, in forms beyond their oldest imaginings. The final, chilling silence of the void was not a void at all, but a classroom. Ilara Vance watched the new cosmos unfold, her eternal form a vessel for a hard-won and painful wisdom. She had once believed that the ultimate goal was to build a fortress against suffering, to create a world where no one would ever feel loss or fear again. We sought to control time to avoid pain, she reflected, her thoughts a quiet hum in the cosmic stillness, and in doing so, we created the greatest pain of all. Stagnation. The perfect loop was a beautiful, sterile artifact in a museum, impressive to look at but devoid of any life. It offered the peace of a finished equation, but it had extinguished the very thing that made existence meaningful, the messy, unpredictable, and often heartbreaking process of becoming. True salvation was never about stopping time. She understood now, but learning to flow with it, in all its terrible, beautiful uncertainty. The fear of a broken heart was what made love profound. The risk of failure was what gave success its taste. The certainty of an ending was what made every fleeting moment precious beyond measure. Their great failure was not in the attempt to save humanity, but in the arrogant assumption that safety was the highest possible good. The final lesson, etched into the soul of a new universe, was that a life without risk is a story without a plot, a song without a melody, a timeless expanse that confuses the absence of hurt for the presence of peace. The silence between universes was no longer empty, but filled with the gentle light of a trillion distant dawns. Each new reality unfolded like a unique flower in an endless garden, its petals colored by different laws of physics. It sent the distinct aroma of alien atmospheres and untold possibilities. Civilizations rose on worlds of crystalline forests and floating cities, their struggles not for mere survival, but for understanding, for art, for connection. A species on a water world learned to communicate through complex patterns of bioluminescence, turning their entire ocean into a living, pulsing tapestry of shared history and emotion. On a desert planet, a society built towering libraries not of books, but of resonant singing stones, each one preserving the voice and wisdom of a single generation. These were not perfect societies. They knew conflict, loss, and hardship, but these challenges were not in points. They were the forge fires that tempered stronger metals of compassion and ingenuity. Each struggle was a unique verse in an epic poem that had no final stanza, a story that was always being written, never simply read. The sheer scale of this vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful multiverse was the ultimate measure of their success. A single, sterile eternity had been traded for an infinite symphony of becoming, each note a life, each melody a world, each movement an entire universe discovering its own voice. The legacy of that impossible choice was not a monument or a restored timeline, but this endless, breathing expanse of wonder, a living testament to the profound truth that a fragile chance at freedom is always worth more than the strongest and most perfect of cages. The quiet between galaxies was a deep and welcoming embrace. Aris felt the solitude not as an absence, but as a different kind of presence. He was a single point of awareness in a cosmos teeming with life, and the distance between him and the vibrant worlds he watched was an illusion. Every civilization that looked up at its own night sky, every child that wondered at the stars, every silent act of courage in a distant city, these were not separate events. They were threads in a single, magnificent tapestry, and his own consciousness was the loom upon which it was all held. His personal history, the lab, the loops, the final sacrifice, all of it had been woven into the foundational pattern of this new reality. He was no longer an individual looking out at a universe. He had become the universe remembering itself. In this state, loneliness was impossible, for he was perpetually in the company of every story ever told. The joy of a first love on a world with twin suns was his joy. The quiet determination of a scientist on the cusp of a discovery was his determination. The grief of a lost species, preserved only in fossil records, was a sorrow he honored and held with reverence. His solitude was the most profound connection imaginable, a silent communion with the infinite chorus of existence. He had not been left behind by time. He had become its silent, grateful witness, forever part of the beautiful, unending whole. The vibrant hum of countless new universes had settled into a self-sustaining rhythm, a symphony that no longer needed conductors. Within this cosmic harmony, the three Guardians felt a subtle but undeniable shift. The intense focus of their consciousness, the sharp edge of their eternal vigil, began to soften. It was not a weakening, but a gentle diffusion, like a single drop of ink spreading through a vast, clear ocean. Their individual thoughts and memories, the very energy of their being, started to bleed into the cosmic background radiation, the faint, warm glow left over from the birth of all things. The mission that had defined their existence for eons was reaching its natural conclusion. The work was done. They had not simply guarded the new realities from a distance, They had become part of their foundation, a silent blessing woven into the laws of physics themselves. Their purpose had been to ensure the story had a chance to begin. And now that the narrative was writing itself across countless worlds, their constant oversight was no longer a necessity. It was time for the gardeners to step back and let the garden grow wild. This was not an end for them, but the ultimate success, a quiet victory measured in the flourishing of infinite, independent lives. Their watch was ending because it had finally, completely succeeded. The final act of their guardianship was to gracefully let go, allowing their essence to become one with the timeless fabric they had fought so hard to create. A final, peaceful integration into the beautiful chaos they had unleashed. The soft hum of the newborn cosmos is the only sound, a symphony of pure potential playing on an infinite stage. Within that gentle resonance, a final, whispered thought from Aris lingers in the fabric of everything, a truth carried on the light of the first stars. The loop is broken. We are not forever trapped, we are forever free. This is the ultimate resolution, the final answer to the question that began with a blaring temporal alarm in a silent lab. Humanity, when faced with the sterile peace of an endless, repeating day, did not choose safety. It chose life in all its chaotic, unpredictable, and beautiful uncertainty. The entire epic journey, from the first confusing reset to the final, universe-shattering sacrifice, was not a battle for a different kind of prison. It was a fight for the right to feel, to change, to grow, and even to end. The victory was not in finding a perfect world, but in securing the right for all worlds to be imperfect, to learn, and to write their own stories without a final page dictated by fear. This choice echoes through every new civilization that rises to wonder at its own sky, a testament to the indomitable spirit that values a single, heartfelt moment of genuine experience over an eternity of curated peace. It leaves us not with an ending, but with a beginning, a profound sense of hope that our own struggles and joys are part of a vast, cosmic dance where freedom is the only true constant, and every ending is merely a new note in an everlasting song of wonder.